Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, was the wave of violent anti-Jewish pogroms on November 9th and 10th of 1938. It took place throughout Germany, annexed Austria, and in areas of Czechoslovakia recently occupied by German troops. Kristallnacht owes its name to the shards of shattered glass from the windows of synagogues, homes, and Jewish-owned businesses that lined German streets in the wake of the pogrom. On November 7, 1938, Ernst von Rath, a German embassy official stationed in Paris, was assassinated by Herschel Grimspan, a 17-year-old Polish Jew living illegally in Paris. Grimspan revengefully shot the diplomat after witnessing the expulsion of not only his parents, but thousands of Jews of Polish citizenship living in the German Reich. Von Rath died on November 9, 1938. The same day, at a meeting of Nazi Party leadership, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, a chief instigator of the Kristallnacht pogroms, suggested that world Jewry had conspired to commit the assassination and ordered that any demonstration, while not organized by the Nazi Party, shall not be hampered. Newspapers reported otherwise. After Goebbels' speech, violence erupted in various parts of the Reich. Paramilitary, or SA, and Hitler Youth units throughout Germany and its annexed territories destroyed Jewish-owned homes and businesses. Jewish artifacts were confiscated, and many young, healthy Jewish men were arrested and filled local jails. The rioters destroyed 267 synagogues throughout Germany, Austria, and the Sudetenland. Many synagogues burned throughout the night in full view of public and of local firefighters who had received orders to intervene only to prevent flames from spreading to nearby buildings. SA and Hitler Youth members shattered shop windows of an estimated 7,500 Jewish-owned commercial establishments and looted their wares. Jewish cemeteries became a particular object of desecration in many regions. Mobs of SA men roamed the streets, attacking Jews in their houses and forcing Jews they encountered to perform acts of public humiliation. Kristallnacht claimed the lives of at least 91 Jews. As the pogrom spread, units of the SS and Gestapo, the secret state police, arrested up to 30,000 Jewish males and transferred most of them from local prisons to Dachau and Buchenwald, as well as other concentration camps. In the immediate aftermath of the pogrom, measures were introduced to eliminate Jews and perceived Jewish influence from the German economic sphere. The German government announced that the Jews were to blame for the pogrom, imposing a fine of $400 million on the German Jewish community. German education officials expelled Jewish children still attending German schools. The German government announced laws that enforced Aryanization policy, the transfer of Jewish-owned enterprises and property to the Aryan ownership. The events of Kristallnacht represented one of the most important turning points in Nazi anti-Semitic policy. The Nazi regime moved eventually towards policies of forced immigration and finally toward the realization of a Germany free of Jews by deportation of the Jewish population to the East. It is important to understand and remember these events. It is also important to honor those that lived and died during this destructive part of history. It's probably most critical that we teach the lessons so that it may never happen again.
And I realized how absolutely essential memories are. We are who we are because of what we learn and what we remember. It's essential to identity. It is our identity.
Up until 1938, we had a comparative freedom. In other words, we were able to go to restaurants, we were able to go to the movies, we were able to go to the theater.
We had German and, or I should say, Jewish and non-Jewish friends. And for many, many years, I was not aware that I was different.
I was an enthusiastic Boy Scout and a student and interested in playing football. That's about it.
And privately I took French lessons and piano, not with great success, but...
I had a wonderful childhood. I had a grandmother all to myself. I had 13 dolls. I had roller skates.
I went to a private school from 1930 to 33 called Weinholze Privatschule, and where the teachers were called aunt and uncle. And it was a mixed school, boys and girls, and non-Jews and Jews.
I was proud to be a Jew, and when we had to wear the Jewish star, I never would hide it. I was proud. I said, everybody knows I'm Jewish.
Then there came a day, I don't remember any discussion beforehand, when I was told that I could no longer go to that school.
Teachers on in the corridors, for instance, we had to greet them by raising our hands and saying Heil Hitler.
I had a German girlfriend whom I adored. She was everything I was not. She was slim, she had long hair, she wore glasses, and one day my mother picked us up someplace and she raised her elegant thin arm and said, Heil Hitler, Frau Salinger.
There was a billboard sort of in the center of town. Ironically, it was placed right across the street from the synagogue in town. And on it, every week were placed pages from a Nazi newspaper called Der Stürmer. And of course, the pages that were shown always showed caricatures of, in addition to articles, caricatures of Jews, which were, for want of a better word at this time, comic because it was so exaggerated.
Everything they took away from us. So my father would say, let them have everything. The life they would give us, life they wouldn't take from us.
We didn't really think that would happen in Austria. Hitler invaded on the 12th of March, 1938.
And the next thing I remember very vividly is the stormtroopers marching down the narrow street that was at the side of our apartment building. That Nazi march, the sound of the boots on the ground can put the fear.
And we heard on the radio, which we listened to with earphones, how in 200,000 people in Heldenplatz welcomed Hitler with the most amazing enthusiasm you could imagine.
And after the Anschluss, everybody was soon aware of a wave of arrests that took place of anyone who would conceivably oppose the Nazis.
And all of a sudden, they fired all the Jewish assistant, associate, and full professors. There's a chance for you to move up. So this was fantastic for the non-Jewish academics, and they took full advantage of it.
The difference of feeling now to my last period in Vienna when you couldn't walk on the street without dread of something. You know, this total insecurity of the surrounding population that proved themselves untrustworthy.
She said, let me write to the cousins. So he said, all right. She wrote to the cousins, and by return mail, we had the affidavit for 4 people, and that's what saved us our lives.
I mean, America did not exactly make it easy. That's a myth, the open arms of the Statue of Liberty. I think that's unfortunately not true. Wasn't true then and is not true now.
I recall that when we wanted to leave, people said to my mother, Mrs. Mosheim, this is not really goodbye. It's just temporary. We know you're going to be back within 6 months or so when all this blows over.
And then, of course, came Kristallnacht, and that changed everything.
I climbed through the window to see inside, and it was horrible. It was a sight I will never forget. Everything was burned. The Torah scrolls were just thrown into a bin, and they were half burned. The altar was burned. And I stood there, and I took off a little piece of the Torah, which was against the rules, and a little piece of the altar, and I pasted it into my siddur.
And I hadn't realized how many stores had been Jewish stores, but they knew which ones were.
And I realized how absolutely essential memories are. You know, we are who we are.
Memory and history are far from being identical terms. Memory is always carried by lived people. It creates continuity between past and present. And in fact, it means that the past has no truly past. Memory helps us understand that what we did in the past affects who we are today. And therefore, it is constantly evolving. History, on the other hand, is a problematic and incomplete restoration of something that is already gone. It is always combined with criticism of the memory, and therefore leads to detachment between past and present. End quote, Pierre Noir. We are here tonight because we want to remember. The Kristallnacht for us is not a historical event, but rather an inflection point in our collective memory. 82 years ago, on November 9th, 1938, a terrible pogrom broke throughout Germany and Austria. 267 synagogues were destroyed, more than 7,000 Jewish businesses as well as cemeteries and prayer rooms were damaged or destroyed. More than 30,000 Jewish men were imprisoned in Nazi concentration camps. Torah scrolls were burned. The Kristallnacht represents the moment in which the moral humiliation became a physical threat. It represents a moment of absolute lack of protection, an experience of homelessness and loss. Many years have passed, and the glasses have been swept, but not for us. We still carry those glasses. We know the danger of detaching from this memory, and so we will remember. I would like to invite you to begin this night of memory and reflection by dedicating a moment for memory. If you have a memorial candle, I invite you to prepare that memorial candle. Don't light it yet. I would like to invite our cantorial fellow, Gabriel Newman, to accompany us in this moment with some words of prayer, with some words of music. And take 30 seconds and then light your candle. When you have your candle lit, I invite you to show to the camera, to show it to your camera, to show your candle, so somehow we can all connect in the light of memory. And we will seal these words by saying, אנחנו כאן, we are here, and יזכור עם ישראל, the people of Israel, shall remember. We will remember. I invite you to keep your candle next to you as we start this evening of study, reflection, and I hope inspiration. I have the pleasure to be accompanied by my beloved colleague, Rabbi Rick Steinberg, Senior Rabbi of Congregation Shir Ma'alot, Lisa Armony, the Executive Director of the Rose Project of the Jewish Federation of Orange County, and of course, our guest, Eric Ward, who will be introduced by Lisa in a few more moments. The name of tonight's gathering is Kristallnacht, Antisemitism Implications for Today. And so we would like to start this section, this portion of the evening, by showing a short video of 2 minutes before Lisa goes ahead and introduces Eric.
Good evening, everybody. It's my honor to introduce our special guest for this evening.
Lisa, this is a Zoom thing, and so yes.
My apologies. I didn't realize my video was off.
I didn't want you to notice that tomorrow, so I thought it will be a good idea to let you know.
Good call. Thank you.
Here we go.
Thank you. Over the past 6 months, I've had the good fortune of being in a number of shared digital spaces with our guest, Eric Ward, and have learned so much from his unique insights. And so I know that we're going to share a powerful and empowering experience together this evening. Eric Ward is the executive director of the Western State Center, an organization committed to achieving racial, gender, and economic justice. He's a native of Southern California with an incredible personal journey that I hope he will weave into his remarks this evening. What I will share is that Eric's journey has taken him from a civil rights activist doing primary research, often undercover, of white supremacist groups in the Pacific Northwest, to building critical strategy for some of our country's most important centers for combating inequity, bigotry, and hate, and has become a leader in developing innovative solutions to these issues that empower individuals and connect and build the power of community organizations. His deep knowledge of the Jewish community and of anti-Semitism have made him an important figure bridging the Jewish and Black communities, and someone whose knowledge and insights have been invaluable to my colleagues in the Jewish community around the country. So Eric, I want to thank you so much for being here with us tonight on this very important occasion as we commemorate Kristallnacht. And I'll now turn the program over to you.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be with everyone this evening. I've promised Nico that I would not pontificate all night. I really want to open up space for questions and conversation. We have other great voices here with us this evening. But I do want to reflect on a few things as we begin to have this conversation around the memorial of Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, and as we reflect on the rise of anti-Semitism today, not only in the United States, but around the world, and not just in one part of the political spectrum, though certainly we remain most concerned about it in the United States because of the deep and measurable violence of the white nationalist movement. But more importantly, how anti-Semitism continues to mainstream itself, to evolve in order to scapegoat and to demonize the Jewish community. I think it's important for us to understand a few things this evening. The first is that anti-Semitism isn't simply at the core of white nationalism. And white nationalism is a social movement that developed in the United States in the late 1960s as a direct reaction to the victories of the civil rights movement in this country. In many ways, white nationalism was the backlash. And I think it's important for us to understand the origins of this. Folks often ask me, but Eric, most of your work is around tackling racism. How can you say that anti-Semitism is at the core? And I think the story of the civil rights movement is critically important. We had this thing called the civil rights movement. It's still around with us, but when we hear that term, we think of the 1960s civil rights movement. And this 1960s civil rights movement was victorious in stripping away the idea of segregation as the rule of law in this country. John Lewis, a civil rights icon and Congress member who passed away recently, stated it once in this way. He said, until the civil rights movement, democracy was merely an aspiration, and that the 1960 civil rights movement made it real. And it certainly was real. It was a Black-led, Black-centered movement that was joined by allies, including the Jewish community and many others. That movement was successful at addressing voting rights, segregation, right, and discrimination, as white supremacy before that was de jure, was the rule of law. It was not debated. It wasn't struggled against. It was just the way that things were. The civil rights movement changed that conventional wisdom. It doesn't mean that things are perfect now, but it means that significant ground was made in the 1960s. Now imagine for a second, and it's hard to imagine today, but let's imagine for a second, you're an arch segregationist. You've been raised all of your life to see Black people as inferior, less than. You don't have to convince yourself of it. It is like the air one breathes. It is in the mind of an arch segregationist, a person who believes in Jim Crow, just the way things are. Now imagine just for another second that you wake up one day and you realize your entire country has changed based off of folks you see as inferior. What do? Do you all of a sudden just decide that maybe those people aren't inferior after all? Not likely. That's not how any of us change when confronted with beliefs that we hold dear. In fact, usually when we are confronted with a different truth, we grow resistant or we push back. So too was it for those who were arch segregationists. There was simply no way that they were going to believe, right, that Black people weren't inferior. To believe so would be to deny white superiority and white supremacy that they had been raised in. But they needed to understand, how did they lose against folks they saw as inferior? So they began to look around. And they began to look around at something many of them had learned in Europe as veterans of World War II, or perhaps had been exposed to by their parents. And it was a story called The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. We don't have to go into details with all of you about that, but we know the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion was a false narrative that was created to justify anti-Semitism as a way to attack growing democracy in Europe. It purported to tell the tale of Jewish elders who gathered in a cemetery one night to plot the takeover of European Christendom through the control of the economy, politics, culture. And in the eyes at the time of European Christians, particularly royalists, they argued that Jews were seeking to spread democracy in order to destroy Christianity. That was the narrative of the Protocols. Eventually, it made its way to the United States when a wealthy industrialist by the name of Henry Ford came across the Protocols and republished them as a series of essays called The International Jew, which then he published in his newspaper that was sold around the country in Ford motor dealerships all over, exposing tens of thousands of Americans to this anti-Semitic narrative. But those who had fought in World War II also came across the Protocols. It was a narrative that was quite embedded in the lifeblood of Nazi Europe. In fact, the Nazi Europe government created over 24 different editions of the Protocols during its short lifespan. It was a destructive period. And this narrative continues to be an influential narrative, even when folks don't know the origins of the story. We see periodically the narrative pop up in ways that aren't even meant to be harmful, such as in alien invasion stories, stories like the X-Files created by Chris Carter. We didn't intend it to be an anti-Semitic narrative, but the idea of a secret invasion that seeks to take over humanity through deceit and through deception is at parcel and core of the ideas of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This is the narrative that arch segregationists grabbed onto in the wake of their own loss. For them, it was no longer that they lost to Black people, but a secret Jewish conspiracy. For them, believing and adapting into that anti-Semitic narrative allowed them to then hold together the idea that people of color were inferior. That's why at Western State Center we say anti-Semitism isn't at the core of white nationalism. It is the core of white nationalism. It is so central to white nationalism that Black people and other marginalized groups will never win our freedom if we're not also active in the struggle to uproot anti-Jewish hate. At the foundation of this modern anti-Semitism is the explicit claim that Jews are a separate race. Their position as the greatest trick that the devil ever played, according to white nationalists. Jews, despite and indeed because of the fact that they are seen as white primarily, are also argued to be an enemy race that must be exposed and eliminated. This fantasy of invisible Jewish power explained for the white nationalist movement how a race of supposed inferiors could orchestrate the end of Jim Crow, as I explained before. But not just Black folks, how feminists and the LGBTQ community could upend traditional gender roles, and how workers in unions could mount a challenge to unfair labor practices. Folks constantly ask me, where is the anti-Semitism in the white nationalist movement? It's everywhere. When the Tree of Life shooter said Jews were committing a genocide against white people, he was using a language that was intimately familiar to his fellow white nationalists. Such rabid anti-Semitism is the framework in which the entire movement functions. But let's be clear. Anti-Semitism isn't brought into our communities by white nationalists. They don't bring anti-Semitism to town. They simply organize the anti-Semitism that already exists. Anti-Semitism, like all other forms of bigotry, are not merely a set of behaviors. It is a narrative. It is a conventional wisdom that, left unchecked, continues to grow in our communities, distorting how we understand the world and distorting relationships of power by scapegoating Jews, by misinterpreting their history, by confusing privilege with network. Anti-Semitism, by all counts, has been in the United States for quite a long time. But anti-Semitism, like other forms of bigotry, evolves also. Whereas anti-Jewish hatred before the 1800s was primarily a religious form of bigotry, in the United States, anti-Semitism is not about hating Jews because they are another religion. It is about designing a system of discrimination to scapegoat Jews by accusing them of being another race. You see, anti-Semitism is also a form of racism. Now, let's be clear. It doesn't function like anti-Black racism, but there are things in common. One is anti-Semitism is not just about acts of hate crimes. Anti-Semitism is about a system that seeks to place the Jewish community in a vulnerable role as a buffer between the haves and the have-nots in this country. When people ask me, why does anti-Semitism exist in the Black community and other marginalized communities? My answer is simple. It is because anti-Semitism is functioning in the way that it was designed, to distract those who are without from scapegoating Jews, rather than seeking to address long-standing systems of inequality. Let's be frank. Jews are not the problem in America. Racism and long-time neglect is. I think the Jewish community understands this. The Jewish community has faced its own historical trauma from the Holocaust, one of the most systemic acts of genocide to yet take place in this planet, and hopefully the last. We understand the power of Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht was not merely horrifying because of its physical destruction and attacks on Jewish communities, but also because of the response of the world. For you see, the true test of Kristallnacht was the inability and the unwillingness for the rest of the world to draw a moral barrier against hate. It was a test by Nazi Europe to see what they could get away with in Germany. And once they realized there would be no response, that no one would come to solidarity, it allowed Nazi Germany to enact on the path to the final solution. It was horrifying, the lack of response, the lack of compassion, and the unwillingness to understand the plight of the Jewish world, not just in 1920s and 1930s, but the discrimination and the attacks against Jews that had started long before that. Because we all understand that setting aside misogyny, the hatred of women, that anti-Semitism is one of the longest bigotries to ever exist. So where does this lead us? It leads us to understand that we have to address anti-Semitism as a form of racism, that we need not compare it to the plight of Black Americans to take it seriously, but neither should we conflate the two. That anti-Semitism doesn't exist just in the white nationalist movement. It exists in our society, which means all of us, non-Jewish and Jewish, are susceptible to anti-Semitic tropes and narratives. That the way we buffer and inoculate ourselves from that anti-Semitism is by engaging in curiosity and conversation and debate around what anti-Semitism looks like now. Imagine for a second that we only viewed anti-Black racism in American society through the lens of the 1920s and 30s lynchings. Imagine for a second that we only measured the threat of anti-Black racism through that very lens. What would measure up against it? In the same way, as we remember the horror of Kristallnacht and the importance of standing up against anti-Semitism, let not Kristallnacht be our only lens. Let us understand that anti-Semitism manifests itself each and every day in America, and that those who express it, who have access to power, are a danger, not just to the Jewish community, but to all of us. Those who over the last 4 years in power have used their podium to mainstream hatred and bigotry, to use anti-Jewish stereotypes like globalist or Eastern elite, or I'm trying to think of some of the other ones, right? The attacks on Hollywood, the idea of Jews being dual loyalists. When we look at that type of rhetoric, it creates space, and into that space, violence comes. And as I said to many people before, when that violence erupts, it is not just Jews who pay the price. While we talk about El Paso, Texas, and the killing of Latinos by an individual who is associated with the white nationalist movement, whether we look at Brooklyn or Jersey City, whether we look at Charlottesville or Charleston, South Carolina, where African Americans were gunned down while worshiping, whether we look at Sikhs who were attacked in Wisconsin because the person perceived them to be Muslim, or whether we look at Poway or the Tree of Life in Pittsburgh, let's be clear that while racism, Islamophobia, anti-Jewish hatred were in play, that what drove those murders was the belief by these killers that they were waging an existential war against the Jewish community. You see, in all of these cases, anti-Semitism was the primary motivator. We have to understand the importance of anti-Semitism. We have to build coalitions, which means getting out of our silos. That's how we move over, and that's how we move forward. But getting out of our silos means having hard conversations with one another. It means leading with compassion and with historical memory. We cannot lean on the trauma of our own historical memories and then deny that same, right, feeling, passion, and anger to other communities. We cannot hold the importance of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, of the night of Kristallnacht, and deny the pain and trauma of Tulsa of Minneapolis, of Brooklyn, of Ferguson, of over 500 years of chattel slavery. There's lots of films about chattel slavery. Not one of them shows the brutality of that system. People who were stripped of their language, of their culture, of their tribal affiliations, dehumanized for generations, used as property, where women were regularly sold into prostitution, were raped, where women were left to murder their children rather than allow them to go on in this life of slavery. It was a brutal system that most of us can't even begin to comprehend. If we can't hold the horror of that system, how are we to hold the horror of the Holocaust, which occurred on another continent? It's important for us to understand what we have in common. My family was driven out of Kentucky in the early 1900s. I understand what it means to be displaced. My family fled after the lynching of Mary Denton Thompson, who was taken and lynched from a tree and shot. It horrified my family, and they fled. And so did many Blacks who also understand what it means to flee horror, what it means to not be able to flee, the choiceless choices that get made, whether it happened here in the US or in Europe. We understand the legacy and impact that that historical memory has on our communities. And when we understand the legacy that it has on our own communities, getting out of our silos means embracing what the horror means for other communities. Our destinies are entwined. Blacks and Jews have primarily been the forces that have expanded democracy and rights in American society. It doesn't mean we have to get along every day, but it means we have to continue to commit to building our values together. This isn't about who is right or who is wrong. This is about the society we say we want to build for our children and those who come after. We need to take it as seriously as those who resisted in Europe and those who resist in the United States. This is our time, not to simply climb the mountain, but to stand at the top of the mountain and understand we do not get into the promised land unless we bring everyone with us. That is the task before us, and it does not happen without a robust conversation on anti-Semitism in America. Thank you.
Eric, thank you so very, very much. You quipped at the beginning that you promised you wouldn't pontificate.
And I did.
Pontificate you did not. What you did tonight was to teach and to expose and to teach us math. And that is, there's an equation to this racism. And understanding the components of the equation help us answer the question or deconstruct it and then rebuild it up. You talked about one way to deal with this is to have those hard conversations. And I suppose there's no greater symbol of Judaism than the state of Israel, and gets a lot of focus. And I have found anti-Semitism of late, while there are loud voices that are clearly anti-Semitic, there's a lot of nuanced talk, dog whistles, if you will, but things that people who are even involved in understanding hate, it gets past them because they're talking about disagreeing with Israel, but one might see that as anti-Semitism. Can you talk us through that language and how to understand when something is anti-Semitic, when it's anti-Israel, and when it is not?
Yes. So I don't know if I can answer the question, but I can share my reflections on how I've been wrestling with this. So one of the things we know is that one of the barriers to actually really wrestling and grappling with anti-Semitism in the US right, is the conversation around Israel, Palestinian territories. We know that this conversation often derails. Often when I used to speak about anti-Semitism, well, in fact, up until about 3 years ago, anytime I talked about anti-Semitism, one of the first questions from the audience would be, what's your take on Israel? And, you know, I have to confess, at the point, I had been to Israel and the Palestinian territories once, just about a few weeks before September 11th, in fact. I had gone with a group of human rights activists. We met with a lot of different voices while we were there. And, but beyond that, I mean, I didn't do a lot of thinking about Israel or the Palestinian territories. And, you know, that's probably shocking to everyone on this call. But, you know, quite frankly, to be honest, I thought a lot more about like El Salvador and like Bolivia and, you know, Liberia, South Africa, right? I spent a lot of time, I wasn't just thinking about the US, that just wasn't my priority region of things I was thinking about. So one, I was shocked folks were asking me because I wasn't an expert. So I don't really know at that point why my opinion would have mattered. But I almost likened it at the time, you know, my response at the time was, it was kind of like when I am doing work on racial equity and someone starts asking me about Black on Black crime, right? It almost felt like, you know, I used to joke, and I'm going to get serious here because I really do want to answer this question, but to set the context, I almost likened it. One time I said, you know, the funny thing is when Black folks are talking about racism, no one ever asked me my opinion on Liberia, right? And those who are descendants of slavery here and the relationship in Liberia, right? And so I rejected the question for a while. And then I realized I was not leaning in. And so I did something that I thought was important. I asked a couple of folks that I trusted, I said, look, I need to be able to speak to this question. I'm asking you all to help me design a trip to Israel and Palestinian territories, because I want to talk. I just want to hear from folks. I don't want to talk. I just wanted to listen. And so I met with everyone from elected officials, folks in the Palestinian Authority, settlers, right, former combatants on both sides, you name it, artists, right, you name it. I sat and listened. And here is what I reflect on that experience. The way that I understand anti-Semitism is this. The role of anti-Semitism, right, is to demonize, right, to put anything that seems like or to take any act, place it in a nefarious lens, and then place it on Jews as some kind of like biological function or expression of being Jewish, right, being a Jew. That is the evilness. I don't even know of another word to describe it, but that is the evilness of anti-Semitism, right? And what I came to understand is that I call it the three antis. There's anti-Semitism, there's anti-Zionism, and there's anti-Israel. And anti-Semitism we've talked about, I spoke about that just earlier. Then there's what we call anti-Zionism, right? The idea that Jews do not have a right to self-determination, right? Or to national sovereignty or a homeland. That the idea of Zionism is somehow specially reprehensible over any other kind of national sovereignty ideology that exists. I reject that in most cases. There are some exceptions though, right? And when we lean in and we're being honest, right? You know, Palestinian people who feel displaced by the arrival of Zionism can oppose Zionism without being anti-Semitic, right? That is, I think, a legitimate space. But most folks, that isn't the case. Anti-Zionism, I think in most circumstances, is often coded rhetoric around anti-Semitism, right? The idea of Jews being somehow especially devious or dangerous. Then there's anti-Israel, right? And anti-Israel can be comprised of folks who don't believe Israel should exist as a nation state, right? Where it is, right? And anti-Israel can be folks who are critiquing individual pieces of Israeli government policy. There's nothing wrong with critiquing another nation's policy. But if I could relate this to another way, I would just say this. The stronger you are on anti-Semitism, the more likely it is that your critiques of Israeli government policy or your critiques of Zionism they're less likely to stumble into those anti-Semitic tropes, right? But I also think the more people come to understand anti-Semitism, the more they would realize how much they stumble into anti-Semitism in conversations. And I'll come back to the black on black crime. Folks approach me all the time. I talk about racism. I talk about white nationalism. And folks say to me all as a form of defense, well, talk to me about black on black crime, as if somehow black folks don't spend a lot of time talking about black on black crime, right? We talk about crime in the black community. We also understand that once you compare it to income, right, it's no more significant than it is in other communities, right? But it has a narrative around it. And that narrative is influenced a lot by racism, right? And racist connotations and racial stereotypes, right? And it becomes a defense as a way of not talking, right, about racism and its impact on Black communities. And I think too often in the United States, that the idea that we can't just talk about anti-Semitism is an unconscious form of anti-Semitism, right? We can talk about Islamophobia, right? We can talk about racism, right? Without needing to address other issues. So can we with anti-Semitism. But the third rail around Israel, Palestine, human rights, national sovereignty, right? Peoplehood, right? Makes it very, very difficult in the United States. And it's supercharged, right? I bet everyone listening right now actually listened to every single word, right? Every single word that I used carries some kind of meaning or trigger, right? For folks. Did I say the right words? And I say that not being an expert, so you can't come back and this is just my reflections. But it's a supercharged conversation. And the only way that I know to kind of get a charge out of a conversation is to actually have that conversation and keep having that conversation, which means being very courageous, because I don't think very many people have the right language or the grammar or understanding of anti-Semitism to do it well here.
I really appreciate that. I'll turn it over to Rabbi Nico and Lisa to ask their question. I would just conclude, the watchword of the Jewish faith is Shema Yisrael. Part of a conversation is you have to listen, right? Yes. So one person has to speak and the other person has to listen, and then that has to be returned. And it maybe takes courage to have that conversation, but it doesn't take much to listen with an open mind and heart if you're able to do it. So thank you for starting the conversation.
Thank you.
Lisa.
Yes, thank you. So Eric, I'm going to ask the next question, and I'm going to, I want to pick up where you talk about this notion that the idea that you can't talk about anti-Semitism is a form of anti-Semitism. And I want to kind of take it down to a practical level, something that we think about in the Jewish community. I find what you're saying about anti-Semitism is fueling white supremacy and white nationalism so compelling and so relevant. And yet, as a Jew, and particularly as a white Jew, I struggle with how to engage with that without appearing insensitive to the harsh reality that people of color contend with every day. Because on the one hand, anti-Semitism may be the core of white nationalist hate. But on the other hand, for white Jews in this country, we just don't experience the extent of the discriminatory practices by the police in housing, healthcare, education. I mean, you know the list, right? And it goes on. So we're in a moment in this country that's focused on racial injustice and inequality, and people of color, particularly the Black community, are at the heart of what needs to be addressed. And I say this, of course, acknowledging that we have brothers and sisters, Jews of color, who experience the discrimination. And yet, and there are many white Jews in this country who are allies and want to be actively engaged in this. And yet there's a feeling that the voices that need to be elevated and must lead in this moment are the voices of people of color. So my question is, how does the Jewish community raise these issues? Can we raise these issues without appearing to be tone deaf to the reality faced today by people of color?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because my answer is going to sound so off the cuff, but it really isn't. The short answer is to talk about anti-Semitism more, right? I think that's critical, and the reason why is we should be clear, right? When Black folks showed up to labor unions in the 30s, 40s, and 50s and knocked on the door and said, this isn't just an issue around wages and working conditions, right? Civil rights and racial justice has to be part of this equation, right? And that was not to take away or to undercut the importance of union power, right? And union organizing. It was to make unions stronger, right? And so I'd like to tell you that when Black folks said that, right, that unions just said, of course, and opened up their doors and, come on in. But we know from civil rights history that was not the case in the 30s and 40s. I'll give another one. In the 80s, when the LGBTQ community showed up, right, to the civil rights movement, right, and said, hey, we think homophobia is an important part of the civil rights equation that needs to be addressed here. I'd love to tell you that the civil rights movement threw open the doors and said, come on in. How did we not see that? But that wasn't the case. Again, it was rejection. It was denial. It was nervousness. It was the fear, right? It's a scarcity model rather than a model of abundance. It is the idea that somehow, right, understanding other forms of bigotry weaken, right, the push for racial justice and equity and economic justice too. It's just not the case. In fact, I believe anti-Semitism, actually fighting anti-Semitism, not anti-Semitism, but confronting, right, anti-Semitism strengthens the push for racial justice. And it does so by defending the most important vehicle for racial justice, right, outside of people, which is democratic practice, small d, right? Democracy, the idea, right, of a republic that is founded on an inclusive democracy, meaning multiracial, transparent, accountable, people-centered, the idea that people actually can come together in a society and govern their own affairs is probably like the most radical ideology I've ever heard, right? When you think about it, and you think about the fact that this democracy continues to strengthen itself, right? This republic only gets better, is quite astounding to me. And so I think it's this. I think understanding anti-Semitism is critical to defending democracy, and democracy is critical to securing racial and gender equity in the United States. I think it's critical to achieving opportunity and prosperity. Citigroup just put out a study about 3 weeks ago that said if there were no racial if there wasn't racial inequality in our economy, right, we would have an extra $5 trillion over the next 5 years. And imagine how this country needs that $5 trillion right now. 51 million Americans out of work right now, right? Over 250,000 people have been lost to COVID, right? Those are resources that inequality, right, is costing all of us. It's costing our society. And in the same way, the unwillingness to address anti-Semitism, right, will continue to stymie the civil rights movement in this period. So we have to take it seriously. With that said, Lisa, I'll just say this. We don't have to compare forms of racism to one another, right? The experience that Black folks experience with racism is different than what Latinos experience, which is different than what Asians experience, and what all of us, all together different from what Indigenous and Native people experience here in this country. It functions in different ways and for different purposes. I think folks struggle with the idea that white-skinned, I call it light-skinned or white-skinned Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, can also experience a form of racism. But indeed they do. And it doesn't look like anti-Black racism. But the fact is, I'll just say this straight up to everyone listening. The moment, right, that racism against the Jewish community looks like racism that Black people experience, we are all in serious trouble, right? It's not why anti-Semitism is used in our society. It's not used as a form of social control, right, against the Jewish community. It's used to scapegoat the Jewish community, right? And so it just looks different. So we shouldn't compare it. There's no reason to deny the experience that Black folks experience, right? But that does not mean that racism, anti-Semitism, a form of racism, doesn't impact the Jewish community. If they're not experiencing the same, it may have less to do with white skin privilege, which is temporal at best, in my opinion, and much more to do with the ability of the Jewish network, who's has a people whose culture remained intact, was able to defend itself from some of the worst aspects of racism in the society. Yet anti-Semitism creates a situation where we blame Jews, right, for actually being able to kind of resist, right, the racialization of their community. Anti-Semitism is a really curious thing in how it functions.
Thank you, Eric. Oh, sorry, Rabbi Steinberg.
Rabbi Nico, please.
So, thank you. I decided to change the question that I was about to ask you by something else. I am listening to you and I am thinking about many of the conversations that I have with my congregants. We are in my congregation, Temple Beth Tikvah, and so is Rabbi Steinberg's congregation. I think we are politically diverse. We have people in the right, we have people in the left, and when it comes to Israel, God knows what. Like, we have all kind of opinions in different topics. Now, it sounds sometimes that there is just anti-Semitism in some of our conversations coming from the right, as we would call it. And there are many of my congregants that feel identified with the right, say, well, wait a moment, like, the left is anti-Semitic as well. And there's a discussion constantly about who is more anti-Semite, who hates Israel more, who is the real threat. And please tell us, right? So please advise, so we know better.
Yeah. I mean, it's physically, we can measurably say that the white nationalist movement is much more dangerous. I mean, we are just a little over 2 years after the Tree of Life killings, right? Murders. We are 3 years, a little over 3 years after Charlottesville, right? We are 18 months after Christchurch in New Zealand, right? I could lay out the names of hundreds of victims of white nationalism in the United States just from the last 4 years, right? The idea that anti-Semitism as a physical threat, right, from the left is at the stage or even close to the white nationalist movement is just not accurate in that way. And so to answer that first part of the question, we first have to ask ourselves, do individual lives matter to us, right? Is that a measure we would use? And if it is a measure we would use, we have to admit that anti-Semitism out of the right has been physically destructive. Now, they're not the only ones, right? Because I know now folks are thinking, well, what about these Black Hebrew Israelites in Jersey City and in Brooklyn? And this is where things get complicated. So I need folks to struggle. Having Black skin does not make you left in America, right? Just as having white skin doesn't make you right in America, right? And Black Hebrew Israelites are not a left-wing movement. The Nation of Islam is not a left-wing movement. These are authoritarian movements. Now, if we want to ask why is the left, at times individuals within the left, aligned with the Nation of Islam, I think that that's a fair question to ask. The answer is people build all kinds of weird coalitions in the pursuit of things. And we see that across the political spectrum. It's not unique to the left. Where I think the anti-Semitism in the left is dangerous is that it contributes to the overall mainstreaming of anti-Semitism in society. So that's one. Two, right? In portions of the left that treat the state of Israel as if it is an existential crisis and doesn't have the right to exist, right? That is a threat for those who see Israel as an important homeland, right? As home, as a country, as a society. And the other way that anti-Semitism is a threat on the left is that an unwillingness to understand anti-Semitism by the left leaves all of us vulnerable, because typically in the society, historically, it has been left liberal progressive movements that have drawn hard moral barriers against bigotry. And if the left is stumbling or flat-footed on anti-Semitism, it's impossible for them to do so. So I think right now, right, anti-Semitism on what folks call the right is terribly dangerous in our society right now. It has mainstreamed in ways that were significant. People placed explosives. People used weapons, right? I am super worried right now about the scapegoating of folks like Kushner and Milner, right, in the Trump administration. Has the Trump administration and elements around it try to come to terms with this presidential loss, right? I worry about the tendency in this anti-Semitic moment in the United States to scapegoat Jews within the Trump administration, right? Which follows similar patterns that happened in Germany after World War I, right? And the Dreyfus affair in France. Now, if you're asking me, can the left be anti-Semitic? Absolutely so. I mean, we can talk about France and the UK, right? That's why I think at the end of the day, we have to be cautious, right? We have to understand that it is anti-Semitism and the power to implement, right? That is the equation that we must be paying the most attention to. The second is drawing a moral barrier against anti-Semitism that is irrelevant to whether a person is on the left or right. That's why you don't hear me talk about left or right anti-Semitism. There is only anti-Semitism in America, and how people choose to tap into it in order to organize. I'm an organizer. I'm a longtime community organizer. Not the best organizer in the world, but I'm not a bad organizer. And one of the things that I know about organizing is you don't use things that don't already exist. If anti-Semitism didn't exist in American society, right, elements in the left, and particularly elements in the right, wouldn't be attempting to use it. They are using it, right, not just to spread bigotry, but to build power. And that's why we cannot be ideological, right? And we can't be partisan in our understanding of anti-Semitism and speaking out. If we are partisan in our condemnation of anti-Semitism, all we are doing is helping anti-Semitism to grow.
Eric, thank you so much. I want to take this opportunity to thank you, ask one last question, and then give you the final word, and then Rabbi Nico will conclude our program. I do want to begin by thanking Temple Beth Tikvah and Rabbi Nico in particular for bringing this program together on behalf of the Jewish Federation of Orange County, Congregation Shir Malot, and Temple Beth Tikvah. We so appreciate your wisdom tonight and your teaching. And you also made a promise to Rabbi Nico right before we began that you will come back again. So
I will.
We will send that invitation shortly. My last question is, are you hopeful? Are you hopeful? And I'll let you have the final word. Just know how grateful our community is for teaching us tonight and for your wisdom that you shared.
Yeah.
Eric.
Am I hopeful? I have seen things over the last 4 years that have been horrific. It was, for folks who don't know me, I have been doing research and organizing against hate groups for nearly 25, almost they're going on 30 years now. I have seen some horrific things in my life, and I can't help but to continually mourn those who are not with us because they were murdered because of their race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, nationality, disability, immigration status. I know too many of those names. And it's easy to grow cynical. And it's easy to grow cynical in the United States at a time where folks have been driven to such divisions. And there are three things that give me hope. The first was my trip to Israel and Palestine, right? It's so funny. I don't know when, I heard that, Israelis and Palestinians were so cynical. I don't know when Americans became more cynical than Israel and Palestinians. And that's not making light of the deep, deep conversations and work that will continue to unfold there. But there was a sense of hope around a better world. It was very tangible and has sat with me over the last year. The second comes from the past. And, I often say when I moved up to Oregon, folks know Oregon, I'm sure every conservative on here is like, oh my God, Oregon, this big liberal, blue state, but, the fact of the matter is when I moved up to Portland, Oregon, in this liberal state, I couldn't get a job. And I was a person, I've been in the Navy, right? I worked hard since I was 13 years old. I could not get a job. I didn't understand at the time that was structural racism. The first person who gave me a job was a Republican, right? Who lived out in rural part of our community, right? Never met a Black person in his life, right? And I helped him out on a job. He liked how I worked. And he was also curious. He wanted to know part of a world that he didn't know. And we spent a lot of time working construction, spent a lot of time arguing, spent a lot of time laughing. And what we figured out was that our values were much strongly aligned in whatever perceived political partisanship we held, right? That every time we talked about values, right? We cared about our families. We wanted a safe, prosperous community. We wanted folks to opportunity. We believed in hard work. Those are the things that bound us together. And it wasn't altogether different because I told you I've been working since I was 13. First person who ever hired me, right, was a Republican in Southern California, right? And I remember those things. And that tells theology at all, that it first starts with the notion that a republic grounded on the radical notion of democracy is the highest form of achievement that humanity has built to this date. Let's not be so quick to throw it out. It takes hard work, but we are hard workers and we're creative people. And when we spend a lot of time with one another across those lines, we actually find out we like each other a lot more than we think. Thank you. I appreciate you all, and I'll see you down there.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
He's originally from Long Beach. He's a neighbor. He's a neighbor. Though he belongs to a different Jewish federation, he's still a neighbor. I can't tell you what a privilege is to share this evening with community and with all of you, and particularly with these Talmidei Chachamim, with these wise students that are wise teachers, Eric and Lisa, and of course my colleague and very, very dear friend, Rabbi Steinberg. And we rabbis like to talk about rabbis. So I want to tell you a story about actually 2 rabbis. I will add one more rabbi, 3 rabbis to my story. So one is my rabbi, my emeritus rabbi, Rabbi Chaim Asa, who was a Shoah survivor, who was a Holocaust survivor, and built a community in Buenos Aires called Emmanuel, or in English, Emmanuel, Temple Emmanuel. That community today is called NSAE Emmanuel. And I, as a child, grew up in NSAE. That other community was founded by my rabbi who I call Grandpa, whose name was Hans Harf. Hans Harf was a student of Liobeck, the great rabbi from Germany. And this is a story that accompanied me as I grew up and today as a rabbi, that tells that in the night of the Kristallnacht, or after the Kristallnacht, after the Hochschule, after the Beit Midrash, the house of study, their synagogue, were destroyed, Rabbi Liobeck gathered a few stones from the debris of the synagogue. And when his students were released from prison, they were between the 30,000 people that went to prison. Once they were released, my rabbi, Lopa, was in prison that night. He gave them, each of them, a stone from the debris of the community and said, now go out, go and build communities. And so they did. My rabbi founded 2 congregations in Buenos Aires. One of them today, Temple NSAE Emmanuel. And that's where these 2 rabbis meet each other. These 2 survivors meet each other in their legacy. About this idea of building community, I don't know if you brought your Chanukia, your menorah, but if you have one, I encourage you to hold it next to you. And don't light your Chanukia, but put the light of your memorial candle next to your Chanukia. Our memory is not to tie us to the past, but it's the force, the strength that helps us build a present and a future, that helps us be builders of community. We are builders of community. We are taking the broken glasses and not forgetting them. We are using them to keep building communities. Your presence here tonight is part of that enterprise. And I want to say that we don't just want to survive. We want to shine. We want to spark light. We want to live. We want to share life. And I invite you to say with me in this night of Kristallnacht, holding the Hanukkah, the menorah that we will be lighting in a month from today, that we will keep bringing light to this world. We won't forget who we are, and we will keep defining who we want to be. We are those who are going to define. And we will say, Am Israel Chai. Repeat with me. Am Israel Chai. The people of Israel is alive, and we will keep creating life. We want to share one more moment, a video with you, some more images. You can put your Hanukkah there, and remember that the light of memory and the light of continuity, they come together if we get to hold them together. And here we go with the video in 1 second. Am Israel Chai. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Rabbi Steinberg. We will now, as soon as we can go back to the gallery view, we will now leave it for you to do some chatting. We are going to open the chat. We won't unmute you because then it will become impossible for you to communicate with each other. But if you want to stay 2 more minutes and do the hallway interaction by trying to see around who is in the gallery view and maybe writing messages to each other, you can do that. And if there are other questions that you would like to share with us for later on, you can always email us, and we will try to keep engaging in these important conversations and in bringing and keeping memory. So you can go into the chat.